Good morning. Welcome back to the planning section 3. And before the Professor David Levine his presentation, I just give the short introduction for him. So it is my great pleasure to introduce David. David is a well-distinguished professor in the I.O., especially major in game theory, decision theory, and general equivalent. And also, he used this kind of approach in the innovation, intelligent property, and behavior. So I believe most of you know much than what I do. So please enjoy me to welcome David.
So as we learned in the last talk, 15 years ago, the PSID started collecting data on consumption. But that actually wasn't the most significant event that took place in economics 15 years ago, because 15 years ago I visited here at the Academia Sinica. And I'm very pleased to return after 15 years and this wonderful conference. I'd like to thank the organizers for setting all this up and making all this possible. So thank you very much to the organizers. Okay, I'm going to talk now, as Monty Python used to say, now for something completely different. I'm going to talk about a positive theory of institutions, and this is perhaps a subset of work that Salvatore Modica and I started on a couple of years ago. And it starts, well, there are different places you can start, but I think the basic starting point personally is as a game theorist who's familiar with repeated games and has done a lot of work on repeated games. And we think of repeated games as self-enforcing contracts or potential institutional arrangements. The first thing we realize is that there's a great many possibilities. And actually, of course, if we look at data, we discover that in reality there's as many different institutional arrangements as we can imagine from a theoretical point of view. So I want to talk about whether we might be more likely to observe certain kinds of institutions in practice. That is, I want a positive theory of institutions. And one of the things that I want to focus on is the issue of longevity of institutions. So institutions that survive for longer periods of time, we're more likely to observe, for good or for ill. And I'd like to say something about perhaps what those sorts of institutions might look like, and also something about the broader set of issues that are raised. So the question then is, what causes institutions to last for longer or shorter periods of time? And I'm going to have a particular point of view on that. I'm going to talk about, there is an existing literature, we have, I guess in economics, a sense that institutions that are efficient are more likely to survive. But survive what is the question? So if the issue is competition between different societies through say, voluntary immigration, we would naturally expect people to move to those locations that are relatively more efficient and therefore offer people that live there greater opportunities and greater income and greater utility. But of course, in practice, historically, that seems not to be the form of competition between different societies. Rather, the most important form of competition historically has been conflict. So I'm going to look specifically at a model in which the longevity of institutions is determined by conflict between different institutions. So I'm going to look at evolutionary theory driven by conflict. And I'm going to do this in two stages. So I want to start by just thinking in a general way, what is it that enables a society or a state or institutions to survive conflict? And I'm going to have a simple unidimensional measure of what that is, and I will give it a name, and the name I'll give it is I'll call it state power. So state power is what enables a country or a nation or a society either to prevail over opposing interests or to defend itself against these competing interests. Okay? So in one sense, it's the ability to prevail in armed conflict, but of course that's not really all that's involved. It really involves the ability to mobilize resources when different states and different societies compete with each other. And so there's an issue of social infrastructure, not just how many soldiers you have, but how many police you have, also how many judges you have, how many tax collectors you have, right? Even private sector power can be important in conflict between different nations. And so when we talk about conflict, maybe we think in terms of tanks and machine guns and this sort of thing. But of course, what we also call soft power, bribery, Bribery is important well, I'll get to some examples a little later on. So I just want to start by pointing out that there's different strategies that can be used by institutions in order to sustain high levels of state power and therefore impose their power upon other states and other organizations. And if we think of the Cold War and we think of the polar extremes as being the United States and the Soviet Union, on the one hand, we have the relatively more liberal institutions of the United States with relatively low taxes, but low taxes generate a lot of private economic activity so that the state takes a small fraction of a large total. On the other side, we might think of the USSR with very high tax rate, very substantial interference in day-to-day life of citizens, as a consequence of which relatively little output is generated per capita, but the state takes a high fraction of that small output. So I just want you to bear in mind that these are two different ways of generating state power, and what matters in the end isn't per capita state power, but it's the total amount of power generated by the society in conflict situations. Okay, I'm going to start with two very simple static models to focus our thoughts on the ideas of state power and what it might mean in practice. So this is, in a sense, so I'm going to talk about evolutionary models, but this is going to seem almost not like evolutionary models at the beginning. And this is actually a long tradition in evolution, right? If evolution maximizes fitness, then we can study simple maximization problems to see what sorts, in biological evolution, what sorts of organisms are the most fit. So I'm going to start with two applications of the idea of maximizing state power just to see how that can lead us in some unexpected directions. So this is a simple static model. We're supposing that evolutionary forces, which are not at the moment being described, serve in one way or another to lead institutions to have high levels of state power, and so we can investigate for particular kinds of institutions, institutional situations, what is it about those institutions that generate high levels of state power? So the first one is one you might not think of. I'm going to talk about demography. Okay? So I'm going to think in terms of a model where there's a total amount of output generated by institutional arrangements, so Y will be the output, and N will be the total population, which will be endogenous. And now I'm going to talk about institutions that will control the level of population in a society. So, and I'll have a particular set of institutions in mind in this model, and that will be theta, which is the minimum land required for a man to have one wife. So this society has a fixed amount of land. And for a man to have one wife, he must meet a certain property requirement. If he doesn't have a certain amount of land theta, he's not allowed to marry. This is a very common institutional arrangement in many societies. And then we will supplement that by the additional institutional arrangement that women are prohibited, or let's say severely punished, for giving birth out of wedlock. Okay, so those institutions now are indexed by theta, which is the property requirement basically to have one wife, and I'm going to assume that each wife can have K children. So the actual population is endogenously determined as K, the number of children per woman, per wife, divided by theta, which is the amount of land that a man must have in order to have a wife. And nobody else is allowed to have children in this society. So then, state power is generated how in this society? So there's output. So output's generated by a production function. And so production function here depends on population, the number of workers. And I'm going to have a parameter called B, which is urbanization, and that determines how many workers we can squeeze into this land and still get output. So if there's too many of them, we won't be able to get any output. And it depends on sort of more general technology parameter A. So that just says how much output we get. You know, if A is bigger, we just get more stuff. Okay? And then state power has to depend also on how much output is actually available to the state. And I'm going to assume here the state has available all the output that's not actually used in the production process. So we have to sustain the workers. So Z here, this is a very Malthusian idea. Z is the output requirement to maintain a worker. So this is the gross output, but we have to pay the workers. This is what the workers get. So G, the state power here, would be the net output. Okay? So now we can inquire which institutions, which values of theta, would lead to the largest value of G. Okay? So we start maybe, so why, first of all, do we think of net output as being the important variable here? So I want to think of Malthusian for a moment. So what are the Malthusians? What do the Malthusians say? The Malthusians say that the population should grow until subsistence is reached. So this is output per worker. This is the subsistence level. So this is the Malthusian theory of population. And according to this Malthusian theory of population, everybody should live just at the subsistence level. So now my question is, suppose somebody chooses some other value of theta that generates a higher level of output per person, that the output per person is higher than subsistence. And now suppose a war breaks out between these relatively restrained people who have some positive surplus per capita and these subsistence farmers of Malthus. Who wins the war? The poor subsistence farmers, if they take any time off the fight, they're going to starve to death. They're going to lose the war pretty quickly, right? So it's this G that matters, right? And G, in some sense, is composed of two things. Total population is good because you have more workers, but of course more workers are less productive. So maybe we shouldn't be, if you read the right-wing press, they're worried about the West being overwhelmed by hordes of poor people who reproduce very quickly. But of course, state power is not generated by hordes of poor people who are at the subsistence level. It's generated by hordes of rich people, okay? Which is, of course, what we should be worried about, okay? So let's look at what the theory actually tells us about theta, okay? So institutions that maximize state power, the largest value of the surplus G is generated, well, we just differentiate with respect to theta, and we find the first order condition. It satisfies this condition. So I'll just describe some consequences of this demographic theory. This theory says there is a particular level of population that maximizes state power. And it should neither be too large. You don't want to be too close to subsistence because then you generate basically nothing per worker. And you don't want it to be too small. So if you're very tiny, you might have one really rich person. But one really rich person is going to not do very well in a conflict with a large number of poor people, but not at subsistence. So there's an intermediate level of population. And how does population and per capita income, how does that change with respect to the technology parameters? So in Malthus, both of the technology parameters, A and B, are neutral. Whatever is the technology for urbanization, and whatever is the technology for getting output, okay, of just producing more stuff, Malthus says everybody's always at subsistence. Every bit of technological increase goes into increased population, and nothing goes into per capita income. This theory says something quite different. It says these two different kinds of technological change, urbanization and what we usually think of as neutral technological progress, have completely different consequences. Urbanization is completely neutral. Doesn't change per capita output. Okay? It simply increases the number of people, as in Malthus. Whereas technology that simply raises productivity of workers without changing the shape of the production function has the opposite effect. Once the parameter A grows large enough, well, there's only so many people we can get into this unit of land. There's no point in trying to increase output by having more workers because they won't fit. What we have to do instead is keep the number of workers fixed, and that means that as A, the technology parameter increases, per capita output increases. So this is a problem that has troubled demographers and economists for quite a long time, and yet here's a relatively simple and sensible, straightforward theory, and all it assumes is that institutions maximize state power. So now I'm going to go back to where I started, and I want to talk about different institutions in a dimension of state interference in the economy, and I'll do this through looking at institutions and taxation. So I'm going to give a second model and look in this second model, what does the maximization of state power mean? And so I'm going to have a model with two different groups of people who I'll refer to respectively as state officials and producers, I guess I'm calling them, and producers. And state officials are going to choose what is the level of state power, and producers or workers are going to choose how much effort to put into producing output. And institutions are what is going to enable the state officials to convert the output of the producers through the taxation system into state power. Okay, so there are several ways in which this takes place. So I'm going to start by talking about institutions as being described. So in the case of demography, state institutions are described by parameter theta, which was the land requirements to have a wife. Here the institution is going to be described by what I'll call an exclusiveness parameter, okay, and that will be the extent to which the government, the state, is able to use its power in order to collect taxes. So I want to think here about two different extremes of a way institutions can be organized in a state. So in the one extreme, I want you to think of Western nations, of democracies, and what's characteristic of these institutions is that there are many checks and balances on the exercise of the power of the state. So in the United States, for example, there might be a large army. The United States has a very large fraction of per capita GDP on the military, right? But that military cannot easily be employed domestically in order to, one way or another, either collect taxes, to enforce discipline on citizens, or do almost anything domestically, okay? And so, just to take a simple example to focus our thoughts, think about what would happen if the President of the United States ordered the chief of the American military to assassinate one of his political opponents. Well, the chief of the military would almost certainly not obey the order. In fact, it would be his duty to arrest the President for issuing an illegal order. And if he didn't do that and his subordinates discovered that he hadn't done it, they would arrest him, and their subordinates would arrest them. So this is how institutions work from the point of view of repeated game theory. Institutions are social norms that are enforced by threats, and threats that are backed up by further threats. If I make an illegal order, my subordinates should arrest me. If my subordinates don't arrest me, their subordinates should arrest them. So it never happens. Okay? It's been a long time since a domestic leader in Western country has ordered successfully the assassination or even the murder of a political opponent. Now, maybe by contrast we should think about North Korea, where we have exactly the opposite social norm. So what happens when the head of state of North Korea tells the chief of his military, assassinate my political opponent? The chief of the military says, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, how soon do you need it? Okay? And why? Because if he does not carry out that order, then his subordinate will assassinate him and carry out the order in his stead. It's exactly the opposite social norm. Okay? Now both of these are very stable social norms. Knowing that everybody in the entire society has a duty to enforce these threats. Nobody wants to deviate. Nobody wants to go against the social norm. Okay? So I want to think of this chi then as a measure of what this social norm is. So on the one hand, when chi is equal to 0, we have the pure libertarian state where the government is unable to intervene even to be able to collect taxes. On the other hand, when chi is equal to 1, we have North Korea. Whatever the grand leader says, that must be obeyed. Okay? Those are the two extremes. And so now, what is the most that the government can collect in taxes in one of these societies? So there's two things needed to collect taxes. One is the ability to force people to pay, because people don't generally pay their taxes voluntarily. So you need state power G in order to collect taxes. But you need to be able to use the state power, that is, institutions must permit the state power to be used to collect the taxes. So I'm going to say that the tax rate, or the maximum tax rate, okay, what the society can aggregate potentially for state power is a fraction of the output, and that fraction of output is, I didn't quite get this, that word min. I tried to correct the typo, but I didn't quite get it fixed. Ignore the word min. It's the product of chi times G. So if chi is equal to 0, we have the purely libertarian state, it doesn't matter what G is, we can't collect any taxes. If chi is equal to 1, so we have the pure authoritarian state, then as we increase the amount of state power, we can collect more and more in the way of taxes. So it doesn't matter how nasty the leader is, if there's no state power to enforce the collection of taxes, you still can't get any taxes. So you need both. Okay? Now, let's talk about utility, and then I'll talk about behavior. So utility for producers is very simple. Producers choose an effort level, which is to say an amount of output that they produce. They pay a cost privately for producing that output. They're taxed on the output that they produce, and they consume whatever's left over after taxes. And they may also get some public good benefit from the state power. So maybe the state builds roads or airports or has a good justice system which can be used to enforce private contracts. And all these things are things that may make producers better off. Now, what about the state officials? What is their motivation? So state officials, there's many of them. There's not one person in any state that runs the entire state and collects all the taxes. So there's a group of people involved in this enterprise. Now, we can argue from an individual point of view, we can have an equilibrium among state officials where they agree to use the proceeds of taxes for the purposes of the state. But of course, there's always a temptation, which we observe often in practice. If you collect all these tax money, why use it to pay for a good judicial system and good roads? Why not use it to build nice villas for yourself instead? So it could be that there's a social equilibrium among the state officials, but that begs the question. And this is a missing ingredient in the theory of institutions I am not going to try to fill in today except by assumption. And that is the issue of how groups are able to collude with one another in an institutional setting. So what keeps state officials from just getting together and saying, look, here are these institutions. We're supposed to prosecute each other if we steal the money and use it for ourselves. But this is stupid. Why don't we all agree that none of us will prosecute each other and we'll just use the money for our own villas? And I'm going to, in fact, assume that the state officials can collude perfectly. But nevertheless, they do wish to invest something in state power. Why? Because they're siphoning money off of the taxes. They can't collect any taxes, there's nothing to siphon off. So here, state officials who act collusively are residual claimants. They collect all the taxes, and they pay for all the state power, and they get whatever's left over. And they don't want to choose state power equals 0, because then they'll collect no taxes and they'll have no villas. But they don't want to divert all the money into state power, because then they'll have no villas. So it's the theory of the kleptocratic government, if you want to think of it that way. So here, for any given set of institutions, as measured by chi, we'll look at an equilibrium, which here will be a Stackelberg equilibrium. State officials will move first. They'll choose a level of state power. Producers will anticipate the corresponding level of taxes, determine how much to produce. They will then be taxed, and everybody will consume. That's the model. And so in this model, with a technical assumption I'm not going to try to describe, it's actually not a complicated technical assumption, okay? With a technical assumption on the nature of the production, or the cost function for effort C, we can show that for any given institutional parameter chi, there's a unique equilibrium level of state power. And what we're interested in knowing is, how does that state power vary with chi? What sort of institutions give rise to a lot of state power, and what sort of institutions gives rise to a small amount of state power? And so the answer is that this function is single-peaked, meaning, well, what happens when chi is equal to 0, the libertarian state? There's no taxes, there's no government officials, they don't spend anything, and there's no state power. So they're at 0. Now, as chi increases, okay, initially what happens is you start increasing G, the state power, so you can collect some taxes. But eventually, if chi is very large, so if you have a very authoritarian state, then you don't need a lot of state power to collect taxes, and the government officials aren't interested in paying for G, they're actually interested in using the money for villas. So as chi gets very large, it actually becomes optimal to reduce state power in a very authoritarian state, so you can have a very high level of consumption. Okay? All right. So what does higher state power mean in terms of the kinds of institutions chi? Okay, so we might want to contrast what economists are usually concerned about when we take a normative point of view, and that's efficiency. What's efficiency here? Well, if there's no public good component of state power, then efficiency is 0 taxes. But if there's a public good component, then you want to have some taxes, and that means you don't want to have purely libertarian institutions. You want to have chi bigger than 0, so the state will collect some taxes. But what's true is, if the public good benefit of state power is not too large, then the efficient level of chi will always be smaller than the state power maximizing level of chi. And that means that the state power maximizing level of chi, the institutions that are chosen by evolution will be inefficient. And not only they will be inefficient, but they'll be inefficient in a particular way. Taxes will be too high. Producers' utility will be too low. Utility for state officials will be too high, all compared to the efficient level. And so in a sense, what you can say is you can say that a more exclusive society, in the sense of having institutions that make it easier to use state power to manipulate domestic affairs, are more extractive in the sense of Acemoglu and Robinson. So here there seems to be, from a positive point of view, a tendency to select institutions which from a normative point of view are too authoritarian, right? The state, in some sense, is perhaps stronger than we would like from an efficiency point of view, but these stronger states that are inefficient domestically and don't generate so much utility for the people that live there last longer because they're better able to defend themselves. So that's sort of the direction in which a theory of state power pushes us. Now, I like to do dynamics. So that's all static models. And it's a very, very funny model of competition between states to say that there's one state and somehow state power is maximized. So what I want to do next is I want to set aside these simple models, but I also want to abstract something from them, which is the idea of state power being determined by social institutions. And I want to look at what happens in a dynamic setting where different societies, in fact, compete with each other. So let me describe a model of competition between societies. So I want to think of there being different societies. So I'm going to have a list of all the different societies. And what's different between these different societies? So different societies differ in their institutions. So chi, right? What are the institutions in these societies like? Different societies might have different institutions. G, different societies generate different levels of state power. A, different societies, within those societies, people do different things. They're the choices of individuals. What choices do the government officials make? How much output do the producers choose to make? Those are A. So those are things that I'm going to think of as being fixed within a society. Society is a particular set of arrangements in which people produce output, there's state power generated, and there's particular institutions. And I'm going to say something about what happens in these societies. So these societies don't change. Rather, they grow and they decline due to competition. So that's an evolutionary model. So a little different than an equilibrium model. Okay? And so these societies are going to compete over resources. And I'm going to call these resources land just to have a name. And I'm going to assume constant returns to scale in land. So basically a society with twice as much land is sort of just twice as big as a society with 1 unit of land. There's no economy of scale in government. There's no economy of scale in production or diseconomy of scale. Also, these societies are going to compete through conflict. So this model from an economic point of view is going to be a pretty primitive model. I'm not going to look at trade between these different societies, though of course in practice that could be pretty important. Okay? All right. So in this world that I'm going to talk about, each society J at each time T controls a certain amount of land. Okay, and they're integral units, which is just important for technical reasons so we can use finite Markov processes to analyze the evolutionary dynamics. And there's really two different kinds, sort of two extreme different kinds of societies that are going to be important in the theory, so I'm going to introduce some terminology. There are societies that are active and there are societies that are inactive. A society is active if it has some land. That represents a society that actually exists. There's resources. Right? This land has people. These people have institutions. They generate state power. They choose actions. It's a real society that exists. Other societies don't have any land. Those are hypothetical societies. They don't exist. Nobody lives in those societies. What they are templates. They represent societies that do not exist at the current time, but they represent social arrangements which people might choose to use at a later time. So they're blueprints for societies rather than active societies. So these are inactive societies. Okay? All right. Now, There's also the possibility that a single society might control all of the land. Rather important cases, it turns out. So I'll refer to a single society that controls all the resources as a hegemony. Okay, it controls everything. So now there's two different dynamics that we're going to look at that are going to drive evolution. One is going to be an internal dynamic. It's going to be learning. So here, I don't want to assume that everybody's in equilibrium all the time. This is not a model of equilibrium. This is a model of evolution. So people make choices. A, they live in certain institutions. They may be dissatisfied with those choices. They may feel that these are the wrong choices. Their incentive constraints aren't satisfied. Producers say, geez, I would do better if I produced less output given the tax rate. So they want to change what they're doing. Okay? I refer to that as learning. Okay? Learning is the conscious desire to change your action or possibly your institutions because you see some deficiency in your own behavior. Okay? And there's two kinds of societies. There's societies that are in equilibrium and there's societies that aren't. Okay, it's really a matter of two things. One is the objective reality and the other the beliefs that go with that reality. So equilibrium means two different things, right? It means that everybody's doing the best that they can given their constraints in their environment. But it means more than that, because to be in equilibrium in a dynamic sense, people have to keep behaving this way. And why would they keep behaving this way? Because they expect their environment and their constraints to remain the same in the future as they are today. And that's a matter of beliefs. So equilibrium requires equilibrium actions, but it also requires equilibrium belief that the other people's actions will be the same in the future and institutions will be the same in the future as they are today. So I'm going to talk about societies that are stable, and that's because they're in equilibrium and people believe that they are in an equilibrium. Or a society could be unstable, meaning that people do not satisfy their incentive constraints, or maybe they do, but nevertheless, they're not sure that other people satisfy their incentive constraints, and therefore they think that things might change. And because they think that things might change, they might try to anticipate that change by changing themselves in advance. If I expect the stock market to crash, I don't just sit here, I sell now, right? I anticipate the change. Okay, so learning is going to be one driving force in this model, and this is a modern type of learning model of the sort that was pioneered by Dean Foster and Peyton Young. Okay, and I'll show you how that works in the Markov sense in a few minutes, but the critical thing is if beliefs are not in equilibrium, then change is going to be more likely. So there are two things that drive societies to change. One is learning, and the other is conflict. Okay, so conflict here is going to result in what I call disruption. Okay, now disruption, I just want to see if there's something on the previous slide here. Did I ever say this? Not yet, okay. Okay, so what happens? What happens if a conflict breaks out? So we might think in terms there's models of conflict, economic models of conflict, and use conflict resolution functions to see how different control over resources and different incentives might lead nations into conflict with one another. But what is the consequence of conflict? I want to say that the consequence of conflict is not conquest, that is, one side conquers land belonging to the other side, but is what I will call disruption. So I could contrast two different things, right? One is Caesar conquered Gaul. That is, he took over all the land belonging to Gaul, or the different tribes of Gaul, and he made it Roman. And he introduced Roman institutions that became part of Rome. That's conquest. Now, the United States invaded Iraq, but it didn't conquer Iraq because it didn't make Iraq part of the United States, and it didn't introduce Iraqi institutions. And this slide, by the way, was written before the events of the last couple of weeks. It did cause Iraq to collapse into chaos. That's what I mean by disruption. It could be conquest or it could be chaos. It just means that something changed. Okay. Now, the other thing I want to talk about is the nature of conflict. So again, it's natural to think of, giant tank armies fighting with these airplanes or something like that. Let's talk about the Ukraine for just a moment. So the Ukraine has become disrupted as a result of conflict. Conflict between whom? Actually, because of conflict between the European Union and the Russian Federation. And it wasn't an armed conflict. If you look at the recent events in the Ukraine, The conflict came about, Ukrainians started fighting with Ukrainians. Why? Because the European Union and the Russian Federation both offered the Ukrainians different bribes to join them. And the government of the Ukraine chose the Russian Federation bribe, and that made a lot of Ukrainians really mad because they would have preferred the European Union bribe, and that caused fighting to break out between Ukrainians in the Ukraine. That is the origin of the current disruption of the Ukraine. So here, the Russian Federation and the European Union disrupted the Ukraine, but not by sending in armies. Eventually, actually, the Russians did send in armies, but the original disruption was caused by simply bribery. Okay, so now I want to put that into the context of a dynamic model, a dynamic Markov model. And so the state variable is the amount of land held by each of these societies. And then there are transition probabilities that say how likely we are to move from a situation where certain societies control land to some other societies controlling land. And I'm going to make a useful simplifying assumption. I'm going to track 1 unit of land at a time. So I'm going to assume that within a single period, only 1 unit of land can change hands. So it's step-by-step change. Of course, in practice, if the time interval is short enough, all change has to be like that, but that's not really the point. So if a society loses a unit of land, I will refer to that as disruption. And several things could happen to disrupted land. It might, disrupted land by definition joins some other society. But it could join either an active society, meaning somebody conquered it, or it could join in an active society, meaning somebody on that land decided to try something new that nobody was doing. We introduced some new institutions, or maybe chaotic institutions. Okay. So, I want to describe kind of the economic fundamentals that go into the determination of conflict resolution, and then I want to tell you the kind of assumptions that we would like to make about the conflict resolution function, and then I would like to draw some conclusions about what the Markovian dynamics, about what the evolutionary dynamics tell us about the positive theory of what sorts of institutions or what sorts of societies we're likely to observe. And then, I think there'll be time, I want to spend a little bit of time looking at some broad historical data to see if the theory actually makes any sense. Okay? So, the chance of disruption, the conflict resolution function, is going to depend upon the state power of the various states, upon how much land these various... state is a bad word in this context. You try to use society rather than state. Why? Because state here could refer to a state as in a nation, or state could refer to a state of the Markov process. So I'll try to reserve state for the Markov process and society for the group of people. Okay, so land holdings of societies, whether or not societies have something to learn or whether they're internally stable because people are dissatisfied. Something that I'll come back to and I'm just going to introduce briefly now, which is whether there are outside forces, meaning other people that are not on this land and are not competing for this land that might nevertheless have an influence over what happens on this land. And a parameter which I'll describe in a bit more, which I'll call epsilon, which those of you who are familiar with evolutionary theory would think of as the probability of mutation, but here actually means something rather different, which is the ease of overcoming overwhelming odds. I'll say what that means in just a moment. So some of these parameters are different in some sense. Epsilon and G0, the outside forces and the ease of overcoming odds, these are kind of basic fundamental numbers that are just fixed, right? The other parameters, the land holdings and the characteristics of society, or to put it differently, the vector of land holdings, this is subject to change over time. This is a dynamic component. Okay. So I'm going to introduce a concept fundamental to sort of modern mathematical evolutionary theory, and that's the notion of resistance. And I'm going to say something, first of all, about how conflict relates to resistance. And I want to talk about two different kinds of conflict. I want to talk about conflict between societies of similar strengths, and I want to talk about conflict between societies where one side is overwhelmingly strong. So let's talk about similar size first. So I want to argue that if you have two societies of similar size, there's a lot of randomness involved in the resolution of conflict. That is, it can go either way. Just because I'm a little bit stronger than you it gives me an advantage, but you still might win, right? Think of the World Cup, or the favorites winning all the matches. Apparently not. Spain is out. Okay, to take a more conflictual one, here's an example of a specific land that went back and forth several times. So it was caught between two relatively strong and relatively equal societies, France and Germany, right? And from 1870 or from 1800 to the end of the Second World War, Alsace-Lorraine, sometimes it was French and sometimes it was German. And the Germans and the French would periodically fight wars, and one would win, and it would belong to one side for a while, and then it would go back. But it was always going back and forth. Okay? Now, that's really different than when there's overwhelming odds involved, because when there's overwhelming odds involved, almost certainly the more powerful group is going to win. Okay? And so here's an example also involving Alsace-Lorraine. In 1913, there was a small revolution in Alsace-Lorraine against the German imperial government, which at that time ruled Alsace-Lorraine. What do you suppose was the consequence of this conflict that involved the beating of a shoemaker and 3,000 people protesting in the street? Lots of people in the area were put in prison, and the revolt was completely smashed by the German imperial government, as you would expect, right? Okay, so here's what I want to say. Epsilon is how likely it is that this shoemaker, Karl Blank, would prevail over the imperial German army and German imperial system. So the probability is not zero. Sometimes people win over very long odds, but it is a small number. Okay? And we're going to hold that small number fixed. And so we're going to be interested in probabilities that have the following form. They will be of the form epsilon to the rth power. When r is equal to 0, epsilon won't matter, and we have a fairly large probability. When r is positive, we're talking about small probabilities, and the bigger is r, the smaller is the probability. So I want you to think of the German Empire being threatened by Karl Blank the shoemaker, right? So what does that mean? It means epsilon is raised to a pretty high power r. That's the chance he has of disrupting a unit of land, Alsace-Lorraine, and taking it away from the German Empire. Okay? So r we refer to as resistance. Technically it's that exponent, but conceptually it's the opposite of probability. The probability of the German Empire being disrupted is smaller, the greater is the resistance of the German Empire to disruption. So R in this case was a pretty big number. Karl Blank didn't stand much of a chance of success. The resistance of the imperial German system was much too great. That's what R means. When R is 0, that is Germany against France, two opponents of relatively equal ability. So now I'm going to describe conflict resolution in terms of resistance. I want to say, how able is a society to resist disruption? Okay. So there's two different kinds of societies. There are unstable societies where internally people do not satisfy their incentive constraints, and therefore, or they do not believe that their incentive constraints will be satisfied in the future, therefore they have a desire for individual change. And so I want to say that those societies, those are unstable, meaning that there's a substantial chance of change. What is change in this model? Change is a unit of land being disrupted. Okay, the way a society changes is a unit of land, people change what they're doing. So I want to say that the resistance to change in an unstable society is 0. There's a substantial chance that if people are not satisfying their incentive constraints, they will do something different. Okay? That turns out to be a very strong force towards equilibrium. All right. Stable societies. Stable societies, change is driven by conflict. Stable societies, we're in equilibrium, we're relatively stable. We have a social norm that works. So what causes disruption in a working society where everybody says, my incentive constraints are satisfied, I'm in the right place? Okay. Here it will be conflict. And so conflict will depend upon state power and upon land. And the stronger is a society, that is, the more state power it has and the more land it has, the greater its resistance to disruption. The more state power its opponents have and the more land its opponents have, the more subject it is to disruption, the less resistance it has. Okay? I want sort of an anonymity assumption, and the other assumption that I want is that divided opponents are less strong than unified opponents. That makes perfectly good sense. And then finally, what's really a normalization assumption. I want to assume that when it's France against Germany, that land changes hands relatively quickly, that there's an appreciable chance that one or the other side prevails over a unit of land. And what I'll do that is do that by saying that the weakest society has zero resistance to losing land, whatever's the weakest society. Maybe stronger ones do too, but at least the weakest society has an appreciable chance and zero resistance to losing land. So those are the assumptions that are needed. And then I need to say what happens, who gets the land when it's lost. Okay, so it could either join an active society, or they could adopt new institutions by joining an inactive society. What I want to assume is that, well, first of all, if the land is lost, it can't go back to the original society, so it's got to go somewhere else. So I want to assume there's at least a chance that it goes to active societies, and then some other more technical assumptions. I'm not making assumptions that it gets conquered necessarily, but it might be more likely to be conquered than to be disrupted, or it might be the other way around. Now, outside forces, last element of the theory. So I want to think here in terms of geographical barriers that are asymmetrical. So an example I would give would be, it depends on technology and on geography. So an example I would give would be the English Channel. So the English Channel in modern times has protected England against interference by the continent of Europe, but hasn't protected the continent of Europe from interference by England. Okay. Now that's not always been true. In Julius Caesar's time, the English Channel didn't provide, because of the technology involved, there was no naval warfare at that time. The English couldn't protect themselves against Julius Caesar's invasion, and he invaded England, in fact, twice, the second time very successfully. Okay. But with modern naval technology, a small number of British ships can sink enemy invading fleets and keep England from being invaded, whereas Europe, which has this very long coastline, has a much more difficult time defending itself against incursions by the English. So the English, with respect to continental Europe, would be an example of outside force. The land that is being fought over is continental Europe. Okay. So the French, the Germans, and so forth are fighting over continental Europe. The British are not. They're outside, but they interfere, which they did, of course, all the time, right? But nobody interferes with them. Those are outside forces. So how do the outside forces work? So I want to talk about outside forces are most significant where there's a hegemony, when there's a single society, okay? And what I want to say basically is the stronger are the outsiders, the more likely it is that a hegemonic society will become disrupted. Okay, I'm going to skip actually most of this slide. I just want to say that I'm going to assume that if you have enough state power in a hegemony, then you are relatively safe from outsiders. And if you have too little state power in a hegemony, then there's a chance that you will become disrupted in the presence of outsiders. Okay, so I won't give the examples because we're low on time. Let me give the first theoretical result, which has to do with what we will most of the time observe in an evolutionary process of this sort. So I'm going to define the most state power generated in any equilibrium, in any stable society. So this is only equilibrium, G max. It's the greatest amount of state power that can be generated when the incentive constraints are satisfied. And there's two cases, strong outsiders and weak outsiders. In the case of strong outsiders, there is no society that can generate enough state power to be safe from the outsiders. And the opposite case is weak outsiders, where at least the strongest hegemonies would have some resistance against outside interference. And here's the theorem. The theorem says in the case of strong outsiders, all different states of the Markov process have substantial probability. Pretty much anything could happen. There's no particular tendency towards large levels of state power. You could have lots of states that don't have very much state power. You could have libertarian states. You could have all sorts of things. When outsiders are weak, you get the opposite result. You discover, first of all, that most of the time we will observe hegemony, and that the hegemony we will observe will involve the greatest equilibrium level of state power. So that's the basic result about the positive theory of institutions, what we should observe. Now, Does this make any sense? So usually I present this paper not in Asia, but I present it in Europe. And in Europe, that nobody has any familiarity with hegemony since the Roman Empire. And I say, what's this theory? It says there should always be a hegemony. But of course in China, well, there always has been a hegemony. Okay, so here I've just done some simple computations using historical data of either greater or worse accuracy to try to make a computation for some different parts of the world, what fraction of the time they're in hegemony, and also some areas where there are relatively long hegemonies. Okay, in China, which of course has always had most of the world's population, there's a lot of hegemony. So if we think the random person in the history of the world, we discovered they lived their life under hegemony. Okay. Now, the big exception are two large areas of the world where we haven't seen a lot of hegemony are India and Western Europe. Okay? Now, how do those differ from China? So I'm going to assert the theory says something about when we should observe hegemonies and when we shouldn't observe hegemonies. And it says we should observe hegemonies when the influence of outsiders is weak, and we shouldn't observe hegemonies when the influence of outsiders is strong. And if we calculate who the relevant outsiders seem to be, in Europe, you think of the Vikings and you think of the English as going around constantly disrupting Europe. Population-wise, both Scandinavia and England are pretty big, 5 to 8% compared to Europe. In India, the outside invaders have always come from Central Asia, which, by the way, has never been successfully invaded from India. So it is a one-way geographical barrier. And Central Asia is also relatively populous relative to India, 5%. Okay. Now, where did all the invasions of China come from? Well, there was Japan, but that's very recent history. But before that, all of the invasions came from China, and all the invasions of China came from Mongolia, and nobody lives in Mongolia compared to China. So that the strength of the outsiders in Chinese history is very much smaller than the strength of the outsiders in either Indian or in European history, which is, in a sense, what the theory tells us we should look for in trying to understand the persistence of hegemonies. Now, the theory says a lot more than that. It says things also about how you go from one hegemony to another. And it says that typically it doesn't take that long to get from one hegemony to another, and that the difference between regions with a lot of hegemony and regions with a small amount of hegemony isn't so much the fact that you go quickly, right? So it's not that it says that in China, the reason there's a lot of hegemony isn't because every time a hegemony falls, another one pops up. It says the rate at which hegemonies pop up is about the same in China and Western Europe and India, that the difference is that in China, once a hegemony is formed, it lasts a very long time. It's very long-lived. Whereas with strong outsiders, hegemonies are very short-lived. So here's some data about that. This is the time between hegemonies, after hegemony falls till the next hegemony. Okay? China, 153 years. Egypt, for which the data is terrible, 102 years. Persia, about the same as China, 150 years. It's a little bit longer in Western Europe and India, but not really that much longer. The big difference it's not so much that there were more hegemonies in China. There were hegemonies in Europe and in India. They were very, very short-lived. So you think of the Holy Roman Empire, Charlemagne's empire, something like that. These were hegemonies, but they were very brief. Whereas in China, hegemonies went on for 200, 300, even in some cases 400 years. Okay, I'll wrap up with this because I'm running out of time. So there's more details. The evolutionary theory predicts a lot of small facts. And so if we want to know, does the basic idea of the theory make sense, it seems like a good idea to check many of these predictions of the theory and see if they make sense. So it says this. It says a hegemony will lose land and regain the land. It will have failed revolutions over and over and over again before finally there's a successful invasion or revolution. And it also says, this is a theoretical statement, that the longest failed revolutions and invasions will last considerably longer than the successful ones. Okay? So the one we have some data about is the fall of the Qing dynasty in China in 1911. And indeed, there were a number of failed revolutions,
And one of the longest ones, which was the Dungan Revolt in 1862, a province broke away from Imperial Chinese rule for a period of 15 years, after which it was crushed. Okay, that was a failed revolution. Now, the actual successful revolution in 1911, that took a lot less than a year. Okay, it was much, much shorter. So there's actually certain predictions that are made. I'll just try to summarize now some of these last sets of slides. So there's certain things we should expect. First of all, when hegemonies fail, when nations fail, they will fail, according to this theory, because extremely dedicated, unusually dedicated people who don't care much about their personal welfare are well organized in groups and systematically attempt to overthrow the government or to invade. Okay? It's not a bunch of accidental revolutionaries. That should be a very rare event. It's always extremely, and they will be very lucky in order to be able to do it. So there'll be lots of these bands of zealots who are going to try to overthrow the government, and they will fail. And maybe some of them will last for 15 years, but the successful one, this is all about sample selection bias. Okay, it turns out. The ones that win in the end win quickly, because if they didn't win quickly, they would almost certainly be crushed. Okay, that's why they win quickly. All right, so there's lots of details. Most of this stuff seems to be true in the data that we have. So I'm supposed to wrap up, so let me wrap up with the concluding slide at this point. So I just want to go back to the beginning. We're after here a positive theory of institutions. Which institutions are we most likely to see? So the basic idea is that it's those that are most able to survive conflict that will be the longest lived, and therefore we will see most frequently. So I gave two examples of what it means, what types of institutions are likely to generate a lot of state power, that is, are likely to prevail in conflict. Then I presented a dynamic theory that says what happens when different societies with different levels of state power in fact interact with one another using a conflict resolution function of the type that economists have studied before. And I've asked, what are the characteristic predictions of such a theory? Does such a theory make sense? So it predicts, for example, high state power and hegemony should be associated. It's hard to test for high state power. But it also says outsiders and hegemony should be negatively correlated. That we can look for. It also says that hegemonies that fall very rapidly. That we can look for. So there's a whole series of things that this model says about the nature of the fall of societies and the transitions to new institutions that we can look for in the data to see whether it makes sense to believe that indeed institutions are largely determined by their ability to survive conflict. Let me end on that note.
Thank you. Because the time is almost up, we just opened one very short question. No? Okay, then thank you for David again.
Thank you.